The lady no one noticed was saving lives in the shadows, until a duke chose her. The note arrived before dawn. It was folded twice, pressed between the pages of a household ledger, and slipped under the door of a narrow brick building on Crane Street before the lamplighter had even finished his route. The woman who picked it up read it standing in her coat, still half asleep, one candle burning on the windowsill. By the time the candle had burned an inch, she was already gone. Her name was Elinor Voss. She was 31 years old. She had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 days. The note told her that a woman named Clara had been found on the steps of St. Agatha's Church with 2 children and nowhere to go. Elinor knew what that meant. She also knew that the church doors would not open for another 4 hours, and that 4 hours was too long. She pulled on her second coat, tucked the ledger under her arm, and walked into the cold. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. Elinor had grown up in a world where women like her were expected to do very little. Her father, a minor earl with more land than income, had raised 3 daughters with the understanding that their futures would be determined by the men they married. Her 2 older sisters had followed this plan without complaint. Elinor had not refused it exactly. She had simply ignored it, the way you ignore a door you have no interest in opening. She was 22 when her father died and left her a small inheritance, not large. Not enough to live comfortably for more than a few years without care. Most women in her position would have stretched it, preserved it, guarded it like something fragile. Elinor spent the first £50 within a month. She paid the debt of a seamstress named Dolly whose landlord had threatened to put her children out. She paid the medical bill of a midwife named Frances who had broken her arm and could not work. She did both of these things quietly, without telling anyone, and without expecting to be thanked. The feeling she had afterward was not pride. It was something closer to relief, like setting down a heavy bag she had not realized she was carrying. She never picked it back up. By the time she was 25, she had built something. Not a formal organization. Not a charity with a name on a brass plaque and a committee of wealthy patrons who met once a month and argued about letterheads. What Elinor had built was a system. Small, quiet, and very effective. She knew which merchants in the borough would donate leftover flour without requiring their names to be printed in a report. She knew which doctor would see a patient without asking for payment first, and which one would not. She knew the rhythms of the workhouse intake schedule and exactly how many days a woman had before a decision became irreversible. She had memorized the names of every magistrate in 3 districts, which ones were reasonable and which ones were not, and how to write a letter that would reach the reasonable ones before the unreasonable ones made a ruling. None of this was in any newspaper. None of this was discussed at any dinner party. Elinor was occasionally invited to such gatherings as the quiet, unmarried daughter of the late Earl of Voss, and she attended when it was useful, spoke when spoken to, and spent the rest of the time observing. She watched where the money moved. She listened for the names of families in trouble. She left early. No one thought much about her departure. That was the point. She was not invisible because she was unimportant. She was invisible because she had chosen it, deliberately and completely, the way a person removes a loud color from their wardrobe when they need to move without being watched. Attention was expensive. Attention brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought interference, and interference was the one thing that could dismantle what she had spent years building without a single public acknowledgement. The women she helped called her Miss E. A few knew her full name. Most did not. Clara was waiting on the church steps exactly as the note had described. 2 children, both under 5, both in coats too thin for November. Clara herself was 24, though she looked older, the way hard years have of settling into a face early. She stood when she saw Elinor coming, and Elinor noticed that she stood straight even now, especially now. There was something in that straightness that Elinor recognized. She did not say anything dramatic. She did not say she was here to help or that everything would be all right. She said, "Come with me. It is warm where we are going." Clara came. The building Alina took her to was 3 streets away. From the outside, it looked like any other narrow terraced house on a lane full of narrow terraced houses. There was a sign above the door that read Hartley Linen Cooperative. The sign was accurate. Inside, women did in fact work with linen. They also slept in the 2 upper rooms when they needed to. They also received meals and medical attention from Frances, who had recovered fully from her broken arm, and quiet help navigating whatever situation had brought them there. No one on the street found this suspicious. It was a working building full of working women. Nothing about it invited a second look. This was also the point. Alina settled Clara and the children, wrote 3 entries in her ledger, and by 9 o'clock in the morning was seated across a table from a grain merchant named Oliver who owed her a favor and was about to repay it. She did not raise her voice during this meeting. She did not need to. She simply placed a document on the table, folded her hands, and waited. Oliver looked at the document. He looked at Alina. He nodded. She left with a commitment for 80 pounds of surplus grain, to be delivered quietly, to an address he did not need to write down. On the way home, she passed a woman collecting flowers on the corner who looked up and smiled at her. Alina nodded. The flower woman's daughter was in the 2nd year of a nursing program that Alina had arranged, funded partly by Oliver's previous favor, and partly by a small sum redirected from a charitable committee's printing budget, which had been absurdly large. The committee had never noticed the discrepancy. Alina noticed everything. She arrived home just before noon, ate a bowl of soup standing at her kitchen counter, and opened a fresh page in her ledger. She wrote Clara's name and the date. She wrote the children's ages and the name of the school nearest to Crane Street. She wrote 3 questions she needed to answer before the week was out, and then she drew a line under all of it and moved to the next entry. Outside, the city continued at its ordinary noise. Carriages and voices and the distant rhythm of a street vendor calling out prices. Alina did not look up. She was already thinking about Wednesday. She had not always been this certain. At 22, when she had first given away 50 pounds to Dolly the seamstress, there had been a night of fear afterward. She had sat in her room and calculated and recalculated, and come to the conclusion that she had possibly made a serious mistake. She had very little money. She had no husband, no brother, no reliable patron. The world was not built to support women like her without some form of male authorization at the top of the document. But Dolly's children had not been put out on the street, and Frances had healed and returned to work. And Alina had woken up the following morning with the same strange, quiet feeling of having done the right thing, and had found, to her surprise, that it was stronger than the fear. She had decided to keep going until it stopped working. 9 years later, it had not stopped working. The ledger on her desk held the records of 417 women. Some were entries from years ago, marked with a small notation that meant they were stable, employed, no further need. Some were active, ongoing, requiring weekly attention. A few were complicated situations that had taken months to untangle, and had required Alina to become briefly expert in areas of law she had never expected to study. She had become so. She had no other choice. The society pages, had they covered her, might have described her as plain. She was not plain. She was simply not performing. She kept her dark hair neat and her clothes clean and unremarkable. She had gray eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they stayed on a person slightly longer than was comfortable, taking in more than they wanted to give. She did not fill silences with pleasantries. She did not laugh at things that were not funny. At the one dinner she had attended that previous winter, seated between a widowed baronet who talked exclusively about hunting and a younger man she had been introduced to only as Lord Aldrin, she had managed 7 minutes of conversation with the younger man before excusing herself. He had been talking about the northern counties, specifically about the conditions in the coal towns. He had spoken with a precision and a lack of performance that she found, without exactly meaning to, interesting. She had asked him one question. He had answered it carefully, without talking down to her. Then she had been called away, because a kitchen maid had cut her hand on a serving tray, and needed someone with steady nerves to apply pressure, while the footman fetched the surgeon. She had not thought about Lord Aldrin again. Or at least, she had told herself she had not thought about him. Her ledger had 43 active entries. Clara's was the newest. Alina made a small mark next to it and set down her pen. The soup had gone cold while she was writing. She drank it anyway. Outside, November moved through the city without asking permission, and Alina Voss moved through November the same way, and no one on any of the streets she walked noticed her, and that was precisely how she needed it to be. For now, nobody built a secret by accident. Ina had understood this early. Every system she had ever seen collapse had collapsed for the same reason. Someone, at some point, had stopped paying attention to the small things. A ledger left open on a desk. A conversation held in a room with a door that did not close all the way. A name mentioned to a person who seemed safe but was not. The small things were never small. They were the entire structure, and if you let one of them slip, the rest followed like a row of dominoes set too close together. She had built her network the opposite way. Every decision made slowly. Every person included only after observation, not just trust. Every location chosen not for convenience but for invisibility. She had taken 9 years to build it to its current size, and she could have built it twice as large in half the time if she had been willing to be reckless. She was not willing to be reckless. The women who depended on the network could not afford her ambition. What she had built, by the autumn of her 31st year, was this. 5 locations across the borough, each operating under a different cover. The Hartley Linen Cooperative on Crane Street was the most established, the one she used most often, the one Frances ran day to day with the quiet authority of someone who had survived enough to be afraid of nothing. 2 streets north, above a printer's shop owned by a man named George who asked no questions, and donated the use of his back room on Thursdays. There was a reading and writing class that Alina had started 4 years ago for women who had never been taught either skill. She taught it herself, once a week, and had long since stopped being surprised by how fast a determined woman could learn to read when given the right conditions and a reason. On the east side of the borough, in a building that officially belonged to a charitable sewing society that had quietly dissolved 3 years prior, Alina maintained what she called in her ledger the transition room. This was where women went when they were between situations, between one life ending and another one not yet started. It was furnished simply. 3 beds, a stove, a locked cabinet with basic medicines that Frances had stocked and Alina regularly replenished. There was a rule in the transition room that Alina had stated once and never needed to repeat. You did not ask another woman what had brought her here. You shared the meals, you shared the warmth, and when you left quietly and did not mention the address to anyone. No woman who had ever used the transition room had mentioned the address to anyone. This was not because Alina had frightened them. It was because they understood, without being told in detail, that the address being kept quiet was the thing that kept it available for the next woman who needed it. The 4th location was a contact point rather than a physical space. It was a small dry goods shop run by a widow named Agnes who had been one of Alina's earliest cases. Agnes had come to her 7 years ago with nothing but a child and a debt her late husband had left behind. Alina had settled the debt, helped Agnes secure the shop lease, and for 3 years asked nothing in return. Then, when the network had grown large enough to need a reliable communication point in the Eastern Ward, she had asked Agnes if she would be willing to receive and pass along messages from women who needed to reach Alina without coming to Crane Street directly. Agnes had said yes without hesitating. The system was simple. A woman who needed help would come to the dry goods shop and ask for a specific item that Agnes kept behind the counter. Agnes would take her name and situation in the back room, Write 3 lines in a small book and send word to Alina. Alina would respond within 48 hours. She had never once exceeded 48 hours. Not even when she was ill. Not even during the winter of her 28th year, when she had a fever so bad that Francis had threatened to physically prevent her from getting out of bed. She had gotten out of bed. She had responded within 48 hours. The 5th location was the most complicated and the most important, and Alina never wrote its full address in any document. It was a house on the outer edge of the borough, set back from the road, belonging on paper to a solicitor named Henry, who was the husband of a woman Alina had helped 6 years ago and who had, upon learning what his wife's benefactor had actually been doing all those years, immediately offered any resource he had. Alina had accepted the house. She used it only for the most serious situations, the ones that could not be handled by the network's ordinary channels, the ones that required someone to disappear completely, at least for a while, before reappearing somewhere safer. She had used that house 11 times in 4 years. 11 times. She did not write that number down. She kept it in her head, where it sat with the weight of 11 separate human lives, all of whom were currently somewhere in the world living with a measure of safety they had not had before. She thought about that number sometimes late at night, when the city had gone quiet and the ledger was closed and there was nothing left to calculate. 11 was not a large number. She knew that. Against the scale of what the city contained, 11 was barely a whisper. But 11 was also 11 real women, 11 specific names, 11 mornings that had happened instead of the mornings that might have happened, and that distinction was the thing she held onto when the work felt impossible. It felt impossible fairly often. The money was the constant pressure. Alina's inheritance had been small to begin with, and she had spent a considerable portion of it over the years. What remained she managed with a precision that would have impressed any accountant. She kept 3 separate accounts under different names, a practice that required a level of legal creativity she had developed out of necessity. She redirected surplus funds from charitable committees with bloated administrative budgets, always in amounts small enough not to trigger scrutiny. She received donations from the 3 merchants she trusted, all of whom had daughters or sisters or wives whose situations had at some point intersected with Alina's network. Oliver, the grain merchant, gave quarterly. He also gave information, which was sometimes more valuable than the money. He moved through commercial circles where news traveled faster than it did through official channels, and he had developed the habit of passing along anything that seemed relevant without waiting to be asked. Frederick, who owned a printing business in the West Ward, donated paper and printing time, which Alina used to produce the practical guides she had written over the years. Simple documents, how to navigate a workhouse admission, how to apply for a parish relief payment, what rights a woman had under specific property laws. She wrote them in plain language because plain language was what people could use, and she distributed them quietly through Agnes's shop and through the reading class, and through a few other channels she had established over time. The 3rd merchant was a woman, which made her unusual in the circle. Her name was Harriet, and she ran a textile importing business that had been her father's and was now entirely hers, managed with a competence that the men in her industry had spent a decade trying to pretend they did not notice. Harriet gave money, and she also gave employment. When Alina had a woman in the transition room who was ready to work, who had the steadiness and the capability for steady employment, Harriet was frequently the first person Alina contacted. Harriet had hired 14 women from the network over 7 years. Not one of them had let her down. Alina trusted Harriet completely. She trusted Oliver and Frederick carefully. The distinction mattered. The reading class on Thursday evenings was the part of the work that Alina privately loved most, though she would not have said so to anyone. There was something in watching a woman sound out a word she had never been able to read before that worked on Alina like nothing else did. Not sentimentally. Not with the kind of theatrical emotion she found exhausting in others. Just a clean, solid satisfaction, like a well-made joint in a piece of furniture. It was supposed to hold. It held. Good. The women in the class ranged in age from 19 to 53. The oldest was a woman named Beatrice who had come to the class 2 years ago unable to read her own name, and was now writing letters to her daughter in another city in a handwriting that had gone from uncertain to confident in a progression Alina had watched happen letter by letter. Beatrice brought biscuits on the last Thursday of every month. She made them herself. They were very good. Alina ate them standing up, usually while reviewing the next lesson, and Beatrice pretended not to notice. The network had no official name. Alina had considered giving it one and decided against it. A name made a thing more real, and more real meant more visible, and visible was the one direction she could not afford to go. The women who used it called it different things. Some called it the cooperative. Some called it Miss E's system. Agnes's customers sometimes called it the back room, which was geographically accurate for their experience of it. Alina called it in her own head simply the work. One Tuesday in November, Frances came to Alina with a piece of news that stopped her mid-sentence in a way that almost nothing did. Frances was not a dramatic person. She delivered information the way she delivered medical care, directly and without decoration, which was one of the many reasons Alina valued her. So when Frances set down the bandage she was rolling and said, in her ordinary voice, that she thought someone had been asking questions, Alina put down her pen and gave Frances her complete attention. Someone had been at the workhouse, Frances said. Not a borough official, not a journalist, a man who had asked specific questions about intake records from the past 3 years, specifically about women whose intake had been reversed, whose names had appeared on the intake list and then, sometime within the following week, had disappeared from it again. Alina went very still. The intake reversals were the part of her work she had been most careful about. Each one had been handled through legitimate channels, through proper applications and documented processes, but there was a pattern to them if you knew what to look for. A pattern that, if someone were looking carefully and with the right knowledge, would point toward a source. She asked Frances what the man had looked like. Frances described him. Tall, well-dressed but not showy, spoke quietly, listened more than he talked. Alina filed this description away in the part of her mind that kept the things she could not yet categorize. She did not tell Frances she was worried. She was not sure worried was the right word anyway. She was alert. There was a difference. Worry was an emotion that made you slow. Alert was a state that made you precise. She went back to her ledger. She reviewed the past 18 months of intake reversals. She looked at the pattern the way she imagined a stranger would look at it. She looked for the thing that connected them. What connected them was efficient. Too efficient for a charitable operation of the size the network appeared to be from the outside. Someone looking carefully would be able to see that the reversals happened too quickly, with too much accuracy, to be the result of ordinary charitable application processes. Someone looking carefully would know there was a system behind them. Alina did not sleep well that night. She lay awake with the ledger in her head, going over the numbers, thinking about everything she would have to change if this became a serious problem. In the morning she got up, made tea, and started a new list. She had not built this network by panicking. She was not going to dismantle it for the same reason. But she also could not ignore a man who asked quiet, specific, intelligent questions at a workhouse on a Tuesday. That kind of man was either a threat or something else entirely. She did not yet know which. She needed to find out. The note she wrote was 2 sentences. She gave it to Agnes, who gave it to a woman named Ruth, who worked in a household that employed a solicitor's clerk, who had access to the registry of property and professional licenses that was held at the district offices. The note asked for one thing: the full name and current address of a man who had visited the Aldgate workhouse the previous Tuesday and identified himself as a researcher. It took 4 days. The answer came back in 3 words written on the inside of a paper wrapper that had, on the outside, the appearance of a simple order of buttons purchased from Agnes's shop. The 3 words were, James Aldrin Cairvan. Alina read them standing at her kitchen table, and for the first time in a very long time, she sat down not because she was tired but because she needed a moment. James Aldrin, Lord Aldrin, the Duke of Cairvan. The man who had talked about the northern coal towns at a dinner party 18 months ago, who had spoken about conditions in the harvest-failed counties with a precision that had felt, at the time, like something other than performance, who had listened to her one question and answered it carefully, without adjusting his language downward to accommodate what he assumed she could understand. She had left that dinner early to assist a kitchen maid with a cut hand. She had told herself she had not thought about him since. She sat with the paper wrapper on the table in front of her for a full 3 minutes, which was longer than she spent sitting still under ordinary circumstances. Then she stood up, tucked the wrapper into the back of her ledger, and wrote a new list. What she knew about James Aldrin. She wrote everything she could recall, and then she sent word to Frederick, who knew more than anyone she had ever met about the professional activities of men who moved in elevated circles without drawing excessive attention. Frederick came back to her within a week. What Frederick told her changed the shape of the situation entirely. James Aldrin had not come back from a comfortable 2 years of country touring. He had spent 26 months in the northern counties, working directly in industrial towns that had been largely abandoned by any form of organized support. He had funded 2 fever hospitals out of his own income, not through a trust or a committee, out of his own account, in amounts that were substantial enough to have required real financial sacrifice. He had overseen the construction of a drainage system in one of the mining settlements that had taken 18 months and 3 separate contractors, 2 of whom had abandoned the project before it was completed. The system was still functioning. It had measurably reduced the rate of waterborne illness in that settlement over the following year. He had returned to London 6 weeks ago without any announcement. He had not attended a single social function since his return. He had been to the Aldgate workhouse twice. Alina read Frederick's report standing at the window of her sitting room, watching the street below, where a boy was selling newspapers and a woman with a basket was arguing cheerfully with a vegetable seller about the price of turnips. She read it twice. Then she put it down and thought. The question was not whether the Duke of Cairvan was dangerous to her network. The question was what kind of person he was, and what he intended to do with what he was finding. Those were 2 separate questions, and she needed answers to both before she could decide anything. She decided to answer them herself. She chose a Wednesday morning early. She went to the workhouse, not to the public entrance but to the administrative office on the side, where she had a long-standing and careful relationship with a clerk named Edmund who processed her legitimate applications, and had the good sense never to ask about the ones that arrived through less obvious channels. Edmund was there when she arrived. So was someone else. He was standing at the filing cabinet with his back to her, reading a document with the focused attention of a person who is not pretending to read but actually reading. He had the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to be genuinely patient rather than performing patience. She recognized the difference because she had the same quality herself. She said good morning to Edmund, who looked slightly alarmed in a way that told her he knew who the man was. She accepted the chair Edmund offered. She opened her ledger. The man at the cabinet turned around. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately classify, not surprise exactly, not recognition exactly, something between the two. He said, "Miss Voss." She said, "Your Grace." There was a pause. He said, "You are here about the Hartley applications." It was not a question. He had said it the way someone states a thing they have already worked out. She looked at him directly and said, "What brings you to the Aldgate workhouse on a Wednesday morning?" He considered the question. Then he said, "The same thing that brings you, I think. Though through different channels." She did not react to this. She had long since trained herself out of reacting visibly to things that surprised her. She simply waited. He set the document he had been reading back in the cabinet, closed the drawer, and turned to face her properly. He was taller than she remembered. He had the kind of face that did not do anything unnecessary. No performed charm. No practiced warmth turned on for the room. Just attention. The same quality she had noticed at the dinner party. He said, "I have been looking at the intake reversal records for the past 3 years. The pattern suggests a coordinated operation of significant capability. Someone with legal knowledge, medical access, residential resources, and at least 3 or 4 reliable contacts in the commercial sector." He paused. "The timeframes are remarkable. No reversal took longer than 6 days. The average was under 3. Elinor said nothing. He said, "I am not here to interfere with it." She said, "Why are you here?" He thought about this carefully. She appreciated that he thought before speaking. Too many men of his position answered before they had finished forming the thought. He said, "Because I spent 2 years trying to do similar work in the northern counties, and I wasted the first 8 months building structures that already existed and could have been connected to rather than duplicated. I came back to London and started looking at what was already being done before I started doing anything myself." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "And what do you intend to do with what you have found?" He said, "That depends on what the person running it wants." The clerk Edmund was making himself very busy at the opposite side of the room and not making eye contact with either of them. Elinor closed her ledger. She stood up. She said, "There is a coffee house on Mercer Lane. It opens at 8. If you are there at past, I will give you 40 minutes." She walked out without waiting to see if he agreed. He was there at 8:25. She arrived at 8:30 exactly. He had chosen a table at the back, against the wall, facing the door. She had intended to choose the same table. She sat across from him without comment. She told him enough to confirm what he already appeared to know. She did not tell him the addresses. She did not tell him the names. She told him the structure in broad terms, and she watched his face while she talked. He listened in the way she had noticed at the workhouse, with the whole of his attention, not filing things away for later use but absorbing them as she spoke. He asked 3 questions during the entire 40 minutes. All 3 were good questions. She told him she had not decided what to do with him yet. He said that was fair. She said she would be in touch if she decided anything. She was not sure she would be. She paid for her own coffee, which seemed to amuse him slightly, and she left. On the walk home, she thought about the drainage system in the mining settlement. 18 months, 2 failed contractors, still functioning a year later. She thought about the specificity with which he had described the intake reversal timeframes, under 3 days on average. He had studied the records carefully enough to calculate the average. Most men who meant well were not careful. Careful was rarer than well-meaning. She was not sure what to do with careful. She went home and made a new entry in her ledger. She wrote his name, and next to it in her small, neat handwriting she wrote, "Unknown quantity, too early. Watch." She drew a line under it and went back to work. The November rain came down on Crane Street and Agnes's shop, and the reading class on Thursdays, and the transition room, and the 11 lives, and the 417 entries. And Elinor Voss moved through all of it with the same measured pace she had always used, checking each door, reading each situation, adjusting for each new variable. James Aldrin, Duke of Caervan, was a variable she did not have enough data on yet. She would get more data. She always did. He came back on a Tuesday. He did not come to the coffee house on Mercer Lane. He did not send a note through any of the channels she would have expected someone in his position to use. He came directly to the Hartley Linen Cooperative on Crane Street at 9:30 in the morning, knocked on the door, and when Francis opened it, he gave his name without any title attached to it and said he had some documents for Miss Voss if she had a moment. Francis, who had seen enough in her life to be surprised by nothing, looked at him for a long moment and then looked over her shoulder at Alina, who was standing at the back table reviewing a supply list. Alina did not look up from the supply list. She said, "Bring him in." He came in. The cooperative was not a large space and he was a tall man, and the combination should have felt intrusive. It did not. He moved without taking up more room than necessary, which was a quality Alina had noticed in people who had spent real time in small, crowded places. He set a folder of documents on the corner of the table nearest the door. He did not bring them to her. He did not hold them out. He left them there within reach but not pressing. Then he stood back. She finished the supply list. Then she picked up the folder. Inside were demographic surveys. 3 of them. Detailed, accurate, covering the eastern parishes in a level of granularity she had been trying to obtain for 2 years from the Borough Records Office, which had been unhelpful in the particular way of offices that are not technically obstructing you, but are also not actually helping you. The surveys covered housing density, employment patterns by household, and mortality rates broken down by age and season. The mortality data for children under 5 in winter was not easy reading. She read it anyway, because it was real and because looking away from real things was not a habit she had ever allowed herself. She set the folder down and looked at him. He said, "The parish records office keeps these in a sub-archive that requires a separate access request. The form for the request is on the 4th floor, and the person who approves it is in an office on the 2nd floor, and the 2 of them have not spoken since an argument over a procedural matter in 1887. She said, "How did you get them?" He said, "I asked someone who knew someone who owed someone a favor." She looked at him for a moment longer than was conversational. He said, "You are not the only person who works through networks, Miss Voss." She said, "No, but most people's networks are about different things." He said, "Yes." She asked if he wanted tea. Francis, who was doing something at the other end of the room with focused and unconvincing concentration, made a small sound that might have been approval. He sat down, he drank the tea, he did not ask her anything. He did not explain why he had brought the surveys. He did not make a case for himself or for any kind of partnership or collaboration. He simply sat at the cooperative table in his ordinary clothes and waited. She found this more persuasive than anything he could have said. They talked for an hour, not about the network directly, about the eastern parishes, about the mortality data, about what the housing density numbers meant for a woman with 2 children trying to find affordable lodging within walking distance of any available employment. He knew what the numbers meant. He had looked at them the same way she had, from the perspective of what they required rather than what they described. When he left, he said he would have the contact details of a physician who had recently relocated to the East Ward, and was, by reputation, both capable and willing to work outside standard fee arrangements if she was interested. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 1 day. Then she sent word to Agnes, who sent word through the usual route, that yes, she was interested in the contact details. The physician's name was Dr. Edward Wren. She met him the following Thursday. He was competent, straightforward, and genuinely motivated by something other than money, which she confirmed by asking him 2 questions that only a person with real motivations would answer the way he answered them. She added him to her list of contacts. She added his name to the ledger. She did not add the Duke of Kervon to the ledger. She was not ready to categorize him yet. He came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. He always brought something, not money. She had not asked for money and he had not offered it, which she also found significant. He brought information, maps, a contact in the parish registration office who had been persuaded to expedite certain application processes, the name of a solicitor in the East Ward who handled housing disputes, and had a particular dislike for landlords who raised rents in violation of existing tenancy agreements. Eleanor used all of it. She was not soft about this. She took what was useful and left aside what was not, and she did not allow the usefulness of what he brought to create an obligation she had not agreed to. She told him this directly, one Tuesday when he arrived with a detailed breakdown of the education charity funding allocations across 5 boroughs. She said, "I want you to understand that using what you bring me is not agreement to anything beyond using what you bring me." He said, "I know that." She said, "I am not sure you do." He said, "Miss Voss, I am not here to be owed something. I am here because the work you are doing is the most efficiently structured independent welfare operation I have encountered in 8 years of looking for such things, and I would rather be adjacent to it than duplicating it badly somewhere nearby." She looked at him. He said, "That is the whole of it. I have no other motive." She did not fully believe this, not because she thought he was lying, but because she did not believe most people fully understood their own motives. She did, however, believe that his stated motive was real, that it existed alongside whatever else was there. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." She picked up the education funding breakdown and began reading it. He picked up a supply list from the corner of the table that someone had left there and began going through it without being asked, noting the items that were running low and the ones that were adequately stocked. He did this with the practical attention of a person who has done physical organizational work before and is not embarrassed by it. Francis came in at 11 with a pot of tea and 2 cups and set them on the table without comment. December arrived. The city got colder. The network stretched in the way it always did in winter, when more women needed the transition room and the supply demands from the cooperative increased, and the reading class got more attendance because a warm room with a purpose was a valuable thing. Eleanor managed all of it. He helped where she asked him to, and did not insert himself where she did not. He had very good instincts for which was which. One Thursday evening, after the reading class had ended and Beatrice had gone home with the tin that had held the biscuits, Eleanor was reorganizing the teaching materials when he came in with a stack of printed pamphlets that Frederick had produced from a new set of documents she had written on housing rights. He set them on the table. He was going to leave immediately, she could tell. She said, without turning around, "You knew about this operation before the workhouse." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard a reference to a woman in the Aldgate area who had managed 400 intake reversals in 3 years. I thought it was an exaggeration." She turned around. He said, "It is not an exaggeration." She said, "No." He said quietly, 419. She looked at him. He had been counting. He had looked at the records carefully enough to count each one. She said 423. There were 4 more in October. He said nothing. His expression did not perform anything. It was simply present. She went back to organizing the teaching materials. He said good night. She said good night. He left. She stood in the quiet room for a moment after he had gone, with the smell of chalk and candle wax and Beatrice's biscuits still faintly in the air. And she thought about a man who had counted to 419 and not said a word about it until she had given him an opening. She thought about what kind of person noticed something that significant and chose not to use it as leverage. She added a new line to the entry in her ledger, still unknown, but less so. She blew out the last candle and went home. In January, the East Ward flooding came. It rained for 11 days without stopping. The drainage system in the lower streets of the eastern parish backed up, and 3 families in a close near the market were flooded out of their ground floors in the middle of the night. By morning, there were 9 people without a dry place to sleep and nowhere in the official relief system that could take them fast enough. Alina heard about it from Agnes at 7 in the morning. By 8, she had made 4 decisions. By 9, 2 of the families were in the transition room, and 1 was at the cooperative, and someone Alina trusted was in the 4th location working on a longer arrangement. At 10, Francis arrived with Dr. Wren to check on a child who had been in the cold water for too long. At 10:30, James arrived with 2 cartloads of dry goods, arranged somehow in the space of a few hours, and a contact at the city surveying office who had agreed to look at the drainage situation that same afternoon. Alina did not ask how he had managed this in the time available. She accepted the goods and directed where they should go. She gave him 3 tasks that needed doing and left him to do them. He did them and came back, and she gave him 3 more. They worked side by side for 6 hours without more than practical conversation. He did not manage her. She did not manage him. They moved around each other in the small space of the cooperative with the efficiency of 2 people who had, without discussing it, developed a working understanding of where the other one would be. At 4 in the afternoon, Alina sat down for the first time since 7 in the morning. She sat in the chair at the back table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked at the room, where everything was now organized, accounted for, and workable. He sat across from her. He was tired. He did not pretend not to be. She said, "The drainage contact. Is that something that can be made permanent?" He said, "If I make a formal request through the city works office, it goes into a queue. If I do it through the surveying contact directly, it can be done in a month." She said, "Do it through the contact." He said, "Yes." She drank the cold tea. He said, "I want to say something." She said, "All right." He said, "I have been coming here for 2 months. I have brought what I can bring, and I have tried to be useful without being an obstacle. And I want to say directly that I find this work, and the person doing it, more serious and more remarkable than anything I have encountered in the work I have done. And I am aware that sounds like something a person says when they want something from you. And I want you to know that what I want is not your network, and not your methods, and not any part of the operation." She said, "What do you want?" He said, "To not do the rest of this alone." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the city was making the small sounds it makes when it remembers how to be still. She looked at him. He looked back. He did not fill the silence. He waited. She said, "I have a rule about decisions of this kind." He said, "What is the rule?" She said, "I take the time I need." He said, "That is a good rule." She took 11 days. She did not spend those 11 days being sentimental about it. She spent them the way she spent everything, by looking at it carefully from all sides. She thought about what she knew of him and what she did not know. She thought about the drainage system in the mining settlement that was still functioning. She thought about him counting 419 intake reversals and saying nothing about it. She thought about the demographic surveys left at the corner of the table, within reach but not pressing. She thought about the thing he had said about not wanting to do the rest of it alone. She had not admitted, even to herself, that she felt the same thing. She admitted it now in the privacy of her own head during those 11 days, and it did not feel like weakness. It felt like an accurate account of the situation. On the 12th day, she wrote him a letter. It was 2 sentences long. The first sentence said that she had thought about it carefully, and her answer was yes. The second sentence said that she had 3 conditions that would need to be agreed to before anything was formalized, and she would explain them when she saw him. She sent it through Agnes, because that was the route she used for things that mattered. He received it on a Thursday morning. He sent back a note, also 2 sentences. The first sentence said he agreed to the conditions, all three, before she had stated them. The second sentence said he was aware that this was probably not how she preferred things done, and that he would hear the conditions properly when she was ready. She read the note twice. Then she put it in the back of her ledger with the paper wrapper that had 3 words on it. They were married in March. 8 guests. No announcement in the society pages. No flowers, because Eleanor had spent the flower budget on a new supply of medical materials for Francis. The ceremony was brief and specific, and they both meant every word of it. The society pages discovered the marriage in April, by which point Eleanor had already registered the network under a legal housing trust structure that James had helped arrange through Henry's office. The trust was in her name. She had full legal authority over its accounts and its decisions. He had insisted on this, which had been one of her 3 conditions, and he had agreed to it before she stated it, which told her something she had already begun to believe. He understood what the work was. He understood what it required. He had not come to run it. He had come to help it survive. The world they built after the marriage was larger in every practical sense. The trust expanded. The housing program grew. Harriet's employment network doubled because it finally had enough operational capacity to place women faster than the system could produce them. Dr. Wren opened a second clinic in the Eastern Parish, funded partly by the trust and partly by James's direct involvement, with a medical foundation that had previously been funding things that looked impressive in annual reports, but did not do much on the ground. Eleanor continued to teach the reading class on Thursdays. Beatrice continued to bring biscuits on the last Thursday of every month. The society that had ignored Eleanor Voss for 9 years now found itself presented with the Duchess of Caervan, who was running the largest independent women's housing trust in the borough, and was known to be, by anyone who had actually tried to argue with her in a committee meeting, exactly as formidable as the operation she had built. Some of them were surprised by this. The women who had passed through the linen cooperative, and Agnes's back room, and the reading class, and the transition room, and the house on the outer edge of the borough, were not surprised at all. They had known what she was the whole time. The trust grew to cover 11 parishes over the following decade. The reading program expanded into a formal skills training operation that placed over 300 women in employment in its first 5 years. The Housing Fund supported a legal reform campaign that changed the conditions under which landlords could remove tenants during winter months, a campaign that Eleanor drove herself, sitting in committee rooms with officials who had underestimated her once and did not make that mistake a second time. The buildings carried other names. The plaques on the walls did not say Voss. But the founding charter, which was filed in the district legal office, and which Henry had drafted under Eleanor's specific instruction, carried her name on the 3rd clause, written in her own handwriting. The clause stated that in all decisions made by the trust, the welfare of the individual resident must take priority over the reputation of the institution. Meaning, the person in the room matters more than the name on the building. Meaning, the work is not about being seen doing it. The clause was challenged twice in the courts after her death. Both challenges were brought by institutional bodies that wanted the trust to operate more visibly and more formally, with more attention to its public profile and less to its operational decisions. Both challenges failed. The clause held. Eleanor had written it to hold. She had built everything to hold. In the end, that was what she had always been doing, quietly and without announcement, from the moment she handed £50 to a seamstress named Dolly and felt, for the first time, the particular weight of a decision made in the right direction. She had been building things to hold. The work outlasted her. The clause outlasted her. The 423 women and the hundreds who came after them and their children and their children's children moving through a world that was incrementally less hostile to them because of decisions made in back rooms and cooperative spaces and cold offices by a woman who never wanted her name on the building. She got something better than a name on a building. She got the thing itself standing. That was enough. That had always been enough. The lady one noticed was saving lives in the shadows. Until a duke was quiet enough to hear it. Then the two of them saved more.